on my bucket list is travelling from the UK on a boat all the way to Sarasota. Okay, that's, or vice versa on my bucket
Interesting.
list.
Yeah,
But I'm a little worried about falling over the edge of the earth.
sure.
Any advice?
Well, I mean, if those old maps that I've looked at or anything to trust, I think before you get to the edge of the earth, you'll hit a giant sea serpent of some kind that'll warn you up. So if you see the sea
Good
serpent,
point.
yeah, that's how you know you've gone too far and you need to turn
Yeah.
back around.
Do I need to go to the left or to the right of the sea serpent? I
I don't
can't.
know.
Or should I
I
say?
just on my bucket list is the idea of Colin on a ship and unable to contact me for several months. So that sounds really nice, actually.
You can tell what a landlubber I am, okay? Because you notice how I said left and right rather than port or
That's true.
starboard.
Yeah, that's true. You gave yourself away. Yeah.
I didn't know. So why are we starting off talking about that? Well, I guess the issue is that we're going to talk about a really interesting topic today, which I find very fascinating anyway, and that is context.
Yes.
And I often find that organizations don't think enough about the context that a customer is entering their experience with. So, it's always, they always think that every customer's the same and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And they don't really think of the context in which that experience is playing out. So Ryan and
Yeah.
I had a chat about it, didn't we, mate?
Yeah. So you sent over a TEDx talk, which I'm sure we'll link to in the notes, by a guy named Ken Cukier, I think is how he pronounces it.
Yeah.
And it was about this specifically, and the reason you I think started off by referencing flat Earth is not only because you believe that sincerely, which you do, but also it's Ken in his talk makes reference to some of these ideas that data alone is often not enough to be able to predict how people are going to interpret something. So
Yeah.
we've all lived on this planet our entire lives, as people have for tens of thousands of years, and so we all have kind of the same data about what the Earth around us looks like. And for a long time, it was fairly reasonable to look at the horizon and to assume that it drops off at the edge, especially if you look at like the horizon around the ocean. So you might be, naturally afraid, as Colin is, of falling off the edge of the Earth based off of the data that you observe. But with a reframing of that context, if we can kind of explain things in a different way and put it together with some more data and with some kind of theory or explanation, that new context then provides a different outcome, a different kind of shape. So multiple people can have the same experience, right? They can look at the horizon the same way, but if they have a different context that they're bringing to it,
Yeah.
a different mental model or a different like set of history or a different set of previous experiences, then they can evaluate that same data, that same experience in completely different ways. So we wanted to talk about how organizations are sometimes leaving the context out of evaluating customer experience.
Yeah, and it made me, as I've been doing my due diligence and thinking about this and all that type of stuff before the show, it made me realise that context is actually everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
so
one of my favorite topics. I love talking
yeah,
about this.
I agree. If you think about it, the whole subject of customer experience is based around context. So when I first started in this game, 2001, 2002, 2001, people hadn't really thought about the experience economy, customer experience, etc. And then people like Joe Pine, Lou Carbone, my good self, started to talk about this, everything is within this context of customer experience and start to look at it. And obviously it's grown since then. But I guess the interesting bit for me is that is now a context in which people look at business through, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I guess as we talk about a lot about emotions in a customer experience, and we talk about behavioral science within that customer experience. That again, and some people use the word lens, don't they? That's a lens that you look at it through, and that's therefore the context that you're now viewing what's happening. And the TED talk that you referenced, they drew maps of the stars, and they could justify why the planets were revolving around the Earth, but it wasn't until I don't know who it was. I think it may have been Galileo. I don't know actually.
Copernicus, I believe.
Oh, was it Copernicus? Thank you.
I think so. Yeah.
Who turned around? I know it wasn't me. Put it that way.
It could be you too.
I don't think it was me. But I think they, and this is good news. They were persecuted at that point.
Yeah.
The good news is I wasn't persecuted for writing a customer experience book. How about that?
Not yet. Again, not yet. It could be you too.
It is. So a few other things, because this made me think about, as I was thinking about this, it made me realize a few things. Okay. And I wanted to do my usual bit, mate, of testing these theories with you. Okay.
Okay.
So one thing it made me think about is context just segmentation? So let me progress that theory for a moment. So I would argue that depending upon the customer's context, you should design your experience around the context they are coming to the experience with. So an example I often use is we were working for one of the cellular phone companies in the States, okay? And we were working and doing journey mapping on their lost and stolen process, okay? And what we discovered was that they were treating their customers exactly the same, okay, no matter who it was that was calling in. However, if you had lost your phone in the back of a taxi, the way you were feeling, the context in which you were coming into that lost and stolen process was, I'm feeling a bit stupid. I've made a silly error. I've lost my phone, but it's fairly significant that I've lost my phone. Can you help, etc., etc. And another context that we looked at was that you're female. It's 11:30 at night. Your kids are at home, and you've been mugged. That context is very different to losing the phone in the back of a taxi. And what we discovered was, effectively, the cellular phone company were treating the customer exactly the same. Classic stuff. Well, what's your account number, or what's your I think is a PAC number, or whatever it was at that point. And so it made me think, is context actually segmentation, or is the result of a context segmentation? What do you think?
I think the way that I would phrase it is that segmentation is one of the very important inputs into anticipating context. So you and I are going to bring, if we belong to different segments for a particular product or experience, we're going to bring different sets of experiences and expectations with us into that. And so therefore, that is going to be a really important driver in understanding context. I won't say that they're equivalent, though, because I think there are other things that can also determine context beyond segmentation. But absolutely, segmentation should be where you start if you're trying to determine context, because people are different and they're going to bring different things to it. Have you ever listened to Radio Lab?
No.
Okay, so Radio Lab is a radio show and a podcast. It's very, very good. They explain a lot of science in interesting ways. Highly recommended.
Right.
But they one of the episodes they talked about a researcher who went to go and live with a tribe in the island somewhere in the Pacific, And one of the quirks of their society was that when they would point to something in a direction, they wouldn't talk about left or right. They would talk about kind of the cardinal direction. So they'd say, yeah, that tree, which is, southwest of here, or your northeastern leg is where
Right.
that snake is about to bite. And so for this researcher, it was very, very difficult to, like, every time she wanted to communicate with them, she would have to like stop and think and get her bearings,
Thinking.
and like
Get a
and it
compass
was just
out.
completely bizarre. And it wasn't until she'd been in that tribe for several weeks, I think, that she realized that if she changed her perspective to consider not where she was and where she was looking, but instead to think about looking at the situation from as if she were up in the sky, looking down on herself, then
Right.
it made it very easy for her to figure out what direction things were. And she explained this
Right.
to a tribesman, like this great insight that she had. And he was like, well, yeah, of course. Like, how else would you possibly
Sure.
do it? So because
Sure.
they had these different cultural,
Sure. Yes.
experiences,
And they've
they
been
had
brought
completely
up that
different
way. Yeah.
perspectives
Yeah.
on the exact
Yeah.
same experience.
Yeah. You see, that's interesting because, again, I was thinking that the one of the problems with customer experience again is that when you're within the organization, I think you either get real believers in it
Yes.
or you
Yeah.
don't. And that's an exaggeration. All right. But, you've heard me say before, one of the reasons is that, senior people have not been brought up in that environment. So this really just fits into your example. So, the danger is that senior people within an organization tend to be older. Okay. They're
Yeah.
certainly not typically sort of 22 and I'm now talking about large corporates. But they've been brought up going, this is the way that we do things. This is the thing that produces results. And when someone comes along and goes, well, here's a new lens, here's a new context in which to look at things through, and it's customer experience. I think one of the part of the context that they look at it from is that customer experience is going to cost us money.
Mm-hmm.
So improving the experience will cost us money. And that could be that historical thing that you're referring to, which is, well, in the past it has, or I think it will, because I don't necessarily know all the benefits and I haven't looked at it through the right lens. But is this making sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
No, in fact, I want to tie it back to something you said earlier, because you talked about the difference in perspective, or context, I guess, of management and customers earlier on,
yeah,
right? You talked about how customers are having a certain contextual experience, but then the management or people who are designing the experience are looking at it through a different lens, and so that difference in context is going to cause some potential confusion.
yeah,
You've now just added an additional layer, which is that within the organization itself, different layers of management or management and line employees might also have different contextual experiences. They might also be
yes,
bringing different contexts or perspectives to it.
yeah.
And that can create problems, because now these different people are sometimes viewing the same experience in radically different ways because they have different contexts that they're bringing to it.
I've just had a blinding flash of the bloody obvious.
Let's hear it.
Okay. What we're talking about is
Is it that the
diversity.
Earth is not flat?
I've
Have you
suddenly
been
realised.
chewing on that since the beginning?
I've suddenly realised
Okay,
it's not flat.
I knew you'd
Look,
get there, Colin. I knew you
look out the window. um, but no, when you think about it, I mean what you're describing to a certain extent is diversity. So
yes,
diversity is I'm brought up in a certain way with certain beliefs and maybe different cultures and blah 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 blah. Yeah, and diversity is good because you're actually having, instead of just everybody coming from one particular perspective, you're getting
let me
people
let me
coming in.
pause you there.
Yeah, go
Diversity
on.
can be good from this perspective,
Yes,
right? I mean,
correct.
we've pointed
Yes,
out that it can be that we now have these different perspectives on things, and therefore
what?
we're missing
Yes,
things. But continue your thought, because you're about to say that it can in fact be a strength.
Yes, so you're right to pick me up on that. It can be a strength as long as it's listened to.
Yes.
And
Yes.
whoever the leader is not just ignoring it. I have a very diverse team. I just don't listen to anything they tell me.
I love rejecting all kinds of different ideas. No, I mean, I think that one of the strengths of this podcast, if I'm allowed to say that, is the fact that you and I have very different contextual experiences. And so
Yes.
when you and I look at analyzing a customer experience, you bring this wealth of knowledge from experience of actually doing this in the real world and having managed teams and having developed this.
Yeah.
I'm bringing a more theoretical perspective. I haven't managed teams doing this. I haven't implemented it
Hold on.
in the real world nearly as often as you have. And I think that those two different perspectives enrich these conversations. So it can absolutely be a tremendous strength for an organization.
Yes.
But if it's not kind of addressed in the proper way, then it can be a problem, because now we've got people who are just seeing the world in very different ways and might, dig in their heels and argue that, their perspective is right, instead of trying to learn from the different points of view that are available.
So can we just go back a couple of steps?
Yeah.
Could you just repeat what it is that you're bringing to these podcasts? Because I need to make a note of it.
So I think the strength of these podcasts is mostly me. And then you also sometimes show up for some reason.
Yeah. So, no, you're right. Okay. Did I say that? Did I say you're right?
It's recorded now, and it's on the internet where it will never disappear.
But let's follow that theme down, because this leads me on to my next sort of point, which I wanted to raise. Okay. So if you're talking about, and just in the customer experience context, we're talking about, you've got people listening to the show, I guess, that are interested in customer experience. Okay. They go and talk to people in the organization, and they, those people aren't as necessarily convinced. Maybe they even think that, improving the experience costs money, et cetera, et cetera. So, different opinions. Okay. This is an interesting analogy, because what I find myself doing is changing people's context.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself trying to, if I'm faced with those individuals, and I've been faced with those individuals many times over the years, then effectively what you're doing is you're trying to say, yeah, I understand you're looking at the world through this lens,
Yep.
and that's the context you're coming at this from. But actually, take a look at this, and take a look at this lens, and now look at it from this side, and let me try to explain to you why the Earth is not flat, etc., or just try to explain why some of these things are happening. And particularly, this is the real reason why you've got that problem. It's not an issue of lack. It's the lack of growth is not about the quality of the product or the features on the product. That's the wrong lens, because you pretty much optimized that. It's the experience that you're giving the customers, and can I convert you into being a flat earther? And I'm not trying to be disparaging to people, but can I convert you from being a flat earther to somebody that thinks that the world is round, and therefore customer experience is different?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, when you do your voice of customer work, that's the goal. Like, the voice of the customer is their context, their perspective. And so can we bring that insight into the organization better?
Yeah. So let's not make this all about, though, the internal organization. Okay. Because I want to talk about the customer as well, because, but I think the interesting piece there is, for me, there's this bit about this, a key word, which is perception.
Yep.
Okay. So for me, there's like a perceived customer experience, sorry, a perceived context, should I say, not customer experience. There's a perceived context, okay? And then there's a real context. And the danger is that you can have customers that you start talking to who have a perception about what their real context is. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean, there is a reality out there, to a certain extent. Like from a customer experience standpoint, that matters far, far, far less than the perceived reality of your customers. But I
Yeah.
understand the distinction you're making. Like we can
Well,
take steps to improve, for instance, the response time of
well,
something.
let me give you an example to make
Okay, go ahead.
it easy. And this is a little bit of an embarrassing example. Okay.
Good. I love
Uh,
those.
so we were going to record a show a couple of weeks ago, and I started the day before. I was thinking, okay, got recording the show, plugged all the equipment in, and the microphone wasn't working. And I'm thinking, bloody hell, the microphone's not working again. There's some problem, and I'd happened to just come back from the States to England. Anyway, I'm on the phone to our support people, and I'm convinced there's something wrong with the app that's that runs the microphone, etc. We're on the phone for 45 minutes because it's not picking up signal, right? And then I realised I had the microphone on mute, which was the problem. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is this: is my context was there's some problem with an app,
Right. Right.
but the reality actually was
I
I'd
see.
accidentally pressed the mute. That was the real reality. I'd pressed the mute button. But so it's a bit like, how do you explain then to a customer whose context is one thing that it should
Right.
be
Right. Right.
something else? Does that make sense? Yeah, because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it just building on this one last thing, because it bloody annoys me when I phone through to our famous cable companies, and the first thing they do is to say, "Have you rebooted your router?" And I think, I'm not an idiot, I know how to do this stuff, so don't ask me basic questions. Having said that, I then thought, if he'd have asked me if I'd taken the mute off of my microphone at the beginning, it would have saved 45 minutes of my life. But
uh, yeah. I mean, the point of the star maps, the planet maps, where let me rephrase that. Our perspective, our context can um, sometimes we can incorporate lots of data that should convince us that we're wrong, and we can still kind of fit it into our current context or our current mental model or theory. So that those charts I'm sure you've seen from like medieval astronomers where they chart the Earth as the center of the universe or the center of the
yeah,
solar system, and to make that work, then all the planets going around the Earth now have to do these crazy loop-de-loos and all these like
yeah,
circles and circles within circles. Whereas if we took a different context, a different perspective, and put the sun in the center, then everything now falls into nice concentric rings. But it's the same data. They're still like looking up in the night sky and seeing the location of the planets over time. It's just that they're kind of forcing it into one context or another. So, like, how do you take a customer out of their context and move them into a different context? That can be hard, and it can be impossible unless you've got some kind of a strategy for trying to accomplish that.
yeah. So let's just briefly, because I'm conscious of time, let's talk about some of the importance of understanding customers' context. Okay,
Great.
because I again in preparing for this podcast, it made me think that some like a contextual understanding of a business enables you to provide them provide customers with a much more personalized experience, doesn't it?
Yes.
So if you understand the context, then you can personalize it much, much more. And that by doing that, you're actually starting to show the customer that you understand them at a much deeper level. Yeah. And it also made me think that it also helps you be, and you'll know that I've talked about this for a while now. Where I think the next competitive battleground will be is in providing a proactive experience. Yeah. And I think by understanding the context of the customer, you're going to be able to anticipate their needs at a much greater level. Is this making sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, let me give you an example outside of customer experience to kind of
Yep.
illustrate this. You and I have talked about choice architecture before. This the idea that you can kind of nudge people in various directions based on how you kind of construct the choice set. So as these ideas were popularized, there were a number of brands who wanted to implement this, and so they'd like introduce decoy options or more extreme options. And so now my set of TVs that I'm selling as a manufacturer includes a decoy option or includes an extreme option. That was all fine from the perspective of the manufacturer. But what a lot of these firms failed to realize is that when people are actually evaluating these things, they're doing it on a website or on a store shelf where all of the other brands also have a say and where the retailer also has a say. So the context for the consumer is completely different from the context of the manufacturer who's designing the assortment. I think the same can be said of experiences. So I can design my experience at, say, a restaurant to be, optimal in these various ways, and that's important. But if my customers are dining in the context of like having to drive downtown and having to find parking and then like having to deal with all this stuff, that may be the context within which they're evaluating my restaurant. And unless I can take that perspective, I'm not going to optimize my customer's experience to the maximum extent I can.
Yes. No, I that's a good point. And I think that for me is where the segmentation comes in as well, because
absolutely.
you can therefore turn around and go, well, here we have their 8 segments, but actually underneath those, there may be sub segments, if you want to call it that are contextualized much, much more, and absolutely. It could be that, somebody driving down to the restaurant, well, if they're a millennial, will automatically put themselves on SatNav. If they're a baby boomer, then they probably won't, and they'll probably, pull across the road and ask somebody how to get there or whatever it may be. You get the idea. So let's try and draw this to a close. What usual question? So what advice would you give somebody looking to improve this and understand the context in much better degree?
So you and I are big fans of data, and that remains the case. You need data, but data is not enough because you and I can look at the same data and draw very different conclusions based on our context, how we interpret it. So if we want to understand our customers and our customer experience, gather all the data you can about that experience, but then you also need to understand the perspectives of your customers as they're evaluating them. So that's one. So you need to get as close to the mental model of your customer as you can, close to mimicking their experience if you want to understand them. And then the other one was one that we mentioned earlier, which is recognize the importance of those different perspectives within your organization. And that can cause problems. That can cause lots of conflict. It can also be a source of real value and insight if you treat it appropriately. Those are my 2.
Yeah, no, good. I think for me, there's a couple. One is just understanding that, understanding the context that your customers are coming to you in is critical, and it's not just again the physical context, but it's also the emotional context that customers are coming to you in. Go back to that example of the mobile phone company. Is your phone lost and you've lost it in the back of a taxi, or have you just been mugged? Very different emotional context with people. And I think the other thing for me is that just understanding that customers can come to you and their contact. The first thing is a usual phrase: perception is reality.
Mm-hmm.
But they may actually have the wrong context, and they may be looking at the world through the wrong pair of eyes. And how do you design your experience to gently move them to see the new world, basically? So with that in mind, and going back to seeing the new world and flat earths, I'm going to get in my car and sail over to America and fall off the edge of the earth.
Well, if you're going to sail over in your car, it's going to be a shorter trip than the edge of the earth. We can address that next time.
Maybe I'm mixing my metaphors. So anyway, we look forward to talking to you next week on the show. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. Cheers. Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode.